Welcome to another in our exciting series of conversations with some of our most inspiring women at Imperial College London. I want to thank Pinky Lalani and Marty Wickstrom for their support and help creating this series and for connecting us to their wonderful network of friends. Welcome to all of you. Imperial College London is indeed one of the world's greatest universities, focusing on science, engineering, medicine, and business. We have some 20,000 students and 8,000 staff pursuing the forefront of their fields. We also have some of the greatest women academics in the world. I'm excited to say that our research discoveries are ever more present in the news and in our teaching, and we learn new things every day from our community and from the youngest members of our community. So in this series, we decided to connect some of our breathtaking career moments with the ideas and aspirations of our younger colleagues and students. Tonight, we have two very impressive scientists talking about From Nanoscale to the Real World, a look into how small things have a big impact. So let me begin by introducing our luminaries. Professor Mary Ryan is Professor of Materials Science and Nanotechnology and Vice Dean for Research in the Faculty of Engineering. Mary leads a large interdisciplinary group focused on understanding nanoscale, very small scale materials, and the nanoscale interfaces in between materials and their environments. She has a particular interest in the development of operando approaches, that is, ways to measure properties of materials under realistic conditions where they will be used. She has pioneered nanoscale methods in synchrotron science and done many studies at this very small length scale. A key aspect of her research is understanding the reactivity and stability of nanoscale structures in operando in order to maximize their efficiency and the lifetime of devices and systems they serve in. She was elected Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2015 and is a Fellow of the Institute of Materials Minerals and Mining and of the Institute of Corrosion. Welcome, Mary. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Alice. It's an honor to be here.
With her is Aigerim Omirkhan, a postdoctoral research in the Department of Materials, where she is investigating the micromechanical properties of battery cathode materials. Her PhD research under the supervision of Mary Ryan and Professor Jason Riley was focused on electrochemical mechanical coupled corrosion phenomena. She studied the influence of mechanical degradation on repassivation or regrowth of thin oxide films formed on steels in various environments. Aigerim graduated with a Bachelor's of Chemical Engineering from Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan, and has a Master's of Science in Advanced Materials Science and Engineering with distinction from Imperial College London. She is also a founder of the Electrochemical Society student chapter at Imperial and co-chair of the S Electrochem 2019 conference. Welcome, Aigerim. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Alice. It's a pleasure and honor.
So let's start the conversation. Mary, I'd like to start by setting the length scale here. What is a nanomaterial and a nanometer, and why is that size so important?
Okay, so nanometers, that's 10 to the minus 9 of a meter, so a billionth of a meter. It's a length scale where interesting things happen in materials. It's a little bit bigger than the atomic scale. But we can create nanoscale objects, so nanoparticles and nanowires that are on this length scale, and they have very interesting properties. But also, even in bulk materials, a lot of the things that control the properties of things that we see at the macro scale, everyday objects, are dominated by effects that happen down at this very small length scale in terms of what happens at grain boundaries in materials, what happens when in charge transfer in different systems. So down at the nanoscale, we understand that, hopefully we could control materials better. So if we think about nanoscale objects, some properties that are interesting and different to bulk materials, there's a whole bunch of quantum effects that people probably already know about, and quantum confinement that happens in nanoscale materials, so quantum dots. But even outside of that, nanoparticles have got very interesting properties in terms of the chemistry that they will exhibit. So they're often more reactive than the bulk counterpart. And that's to do with the different surface energy that you have in a very small particle with a lot of surface. Normally we can ignore surface energy. And thermodynamics, we don't even teach it quite often at O-level or A-level, GCSE or A-level. But surface energy is a real parameter. And when you get down to the nanoscale, you have to worry about it. Nanoscale objects interact with light differently. So we get different ways of scattering, and that's a property that can be used for sensors. And at the nanoscale, the magnetic properties of material will change. So something that's ferromagnetic, so a permanent magnet. In the bulk scale, when you turn that into a nanoparticle, it becomes what we call a super paramagnetic material. So it's only a magnet in a field, and that means it acts a bit like a magnetic switch, and you can use that property in all kinds of interesting ways. So just to, I guess, to think about the scale in terms of, I guess, scales that we might understand, you could think about a human hair is often described as, a really small thing that we all have a context of, and that's about 100,000 nanometers. So some of these nanoparticles, you're going to get 10,000 nanoparticles on a single human hair. So that's the kind of size of object we're looking at. Or if you want a bit more of a topical reference, then you can think about the size of a nanoparticle to a football is the same order of magnitude difference as a football would be to the diameter of the Earth. So it's they're very small things.
Okay, very small and clearly very interesting with all these interesting properties. And you've made some really exciting discoveries by looking at materials at these length scales. Could you tell us about one of your aha moments, a standout memory that really made you glad you were studying material science?
Oh, there are many such examples, Alice. I think one of the things for me is, and I think I just alluded to, there are lots of these properties of materials and materials interfaces and how materials interface with their environment. And for me, one of the really exciting things is when you see connections between different application areas. So in my research group, we're not siloed into a very specific application. We're very interested in the properties and the interactions and how that might appear in different places. And every so often you're able to go, actually, there's a big connection with these two things. And I've got a couple of slides, actually, which Aigerim has all the slides today because she's much more competent at being in charge of the slides. But there's just to demonstrate, I think, some of this work that we've been thinking about and how it connects across different areas. So if you think about, so we've done a lot of work on zinc oxide, and we started really thinking about deposition of structures, right, in a bulk scale. And everybody, I think, is used to supersaturation phenomena. Anyone that's got a scaly kettle knows that things will precipitate out of a solution and cause problems in bulk systems, right? And that same phenomena happens in pipelines, and it happens in everywhere where you have potential for a supersaturation phenomena. But at the nanoscale, we use that supersaturation phenomena to really try and control what kind of material you get. And so this shows you some work we've done on zinc oxide. And I've drawn a solubility curve here on the left. And that shows you that you can actually switch from being thermodynamically somewhere where zinc 2+ is stable to somewhere where zinc oxide is stable. All right. And actually, it turns out we can, with electrochemistry, very easily shift pH in a system. All right. So by doing that, the oxygen reduction reaction that's written there, we can create hydroxide. So that means we're actually in our system moving the pH towards the alkaline, and you're going to go over that threshold and precipitate out zinc oxide. Now, if you did that just in a normal bulk way without controlling anything else in the system, you just drop out tons of it, right? A bit like when you cool down a saturated solution of sugar, right? We probably all did that experiment at school. Everything comes out of the solution and you get these bulk big crystals. But we developed a bunch of ways to really follow how that process happens in situ. So I'll maybe talk a bit later about how we measured that. That was quite a complicated synchrotron experiment, but we were able to look at the amount of deposition you got as a function of the system parameters. And then once we'd done that, we were able to say, okay, actually, I can design in what I want to make. And so you can make these very dense, compact layers that you see in the top micrograph. And that's an interesting if you want to have some kind of electrode or total conducting layer in the system. Or you can make these perfectly aligned little nano pillars of zinc oxide. And each of those individual structures, so the scale bar, if you see, is 200 nanometers. So they're about 100 nanometers in diameter, and they're single crystals. So each of those pillars is a single crystal And we were able to do that because we followed quite carefully understanding the growth of those systems. And it's really separating nucleation. So when you first get that supersaturation phenomena, so that's the thermodynamics bit, to how it grows, which is the kinetics bit. And a lot of nanotechnology is separating out thermodynamics and kinetics. But then we started to think about, if you jump to the next slide, maybe, Aigerim, think about actually toxicity. So working with my colleague Alex Porter and Terry Tetley, two other brilliant female professors in the college, trying to understand toxicity of nanostructures. And this kind of ties into thinking about all the responsible development of technology, right? You want to create something at the nanoscale. Is it going to be safe? And it turns out that a lot of the toxicity of nanomaterials is related to how reactive they are. Will they dissolve? Will they stimulate other reactions in the body? And we understood that actually for zinc oxide, the toxicity was related to it dissolving inside cells. And then we went one step further and we said, actually, we can control that dissolution of zinc oxide in cells. So that's the same solubility curve that I just showed you. But now you're stepping back from the solid zinc oxide and into the zinc 2+. And what we have here is an extracellular pH. So if you're in the body, but not inside the cell, so in the plasma, you have a near neutral pH and the zinc oxide is perfectly stable. But inside the cell, the pH drops and the zinc oxide will dissolve. And so we were able to tune this so that the cells that you see in the micrograph on the right, so I don't know if you can run the video, Aigerim, so they're breast cancer cells. And what you see is we're going to dose those with zinc oxide nanoparticles. And there's two dyes in that imaging. One will tag for zinc 2+. So when you see it go green, that tells you the zinc oxide particle is dissolving, and you see that only happens inside the cells. And then there's a red dye that will stay in the nucleus. So that tells you that cell has died. And so this, I guess, understanding very carefully of how and when nanostructures will form and dissolve, you're able to translate from two extraordinarily different fields, right? From something that's potentially used in a solar cell to something that's potentially used in a cancer treatment. But the science, the underpinning science is all exactly the same, right? It's how you understand and control the nanoscale properties of that material and when it's stable. So, and you know, there are lots of examples from my lab of people who seem like they're working in completely different fields, but they're doing the same science. And for me, that's one of the most exciting parts of being a material scientist, is that you get to talk to all of these different people and interact with all of these, you know, amazing people doing different things.
So that's really fabulous, Mary. You've gone from, if I may put it crudely, studying corrosion, things like rust or scaling in your kettle, to understanding that you can take those same principles and use them in drug delivery, in treatment of cancers, and in biological systems. So that's, and it's all because that length scale of the particles involved is so appropriate for medicine, I suppose.
That's right. And actually a lot of the environments that you think about, you know, biology is extraordinarily complicated. I won't pretend that bit is simple, but a lot of the way that these inorganic particles respond in the body is that they respond to things like the salinity, the pH, the EH, so the oxidizing potential. And a lot of those things are really just well aligned to thinking about physical chemistry. And so you can create some model systems, if you like, that help us understand what's going to happen in biological systems by thinking about what happens in these bulk systems that we're used to, like seawater, right? So there's in terms of the salinity and the pH, there's quite a lot of analogies that you can make. I mean, obviously, when you start to throw proteins and enzymes and things into the mix, it gets more complicated. But there are some really interesting then feedback loops between what the biomolecules do to the particle and what the presence of the particle does into the body in terms of generating the enzyme response and the immune response.
That's great. Thank you. Aigerim, congratulations. You've recently defended your PhD thesis, and you're embarking on your postdoc. And I'd like to hear about your PhD research. We mentioned that you're working on electrochemical and mechanical. So some of the things like Mary was talking about, but you're adding mechanical forces to these materials. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my PhD was on erosion corrosion. So that's a simpler name for electrochemical mechanical coupled corrosion phenomena. And actually, we wanted to study from the mechanistic point of view what was happening to the materials and how they passivate in presence of mechanical forces. So if you think about, let's say, how we have the metallic hip replacement parts, they also move, right? And they tend to be in an environment which is slightly corrosive, and how these metals passivate is really important for us to know, because it eventually, how Mary has shown, it will affect the toxicity of the materials, right? So in order to study that, we have built a very robust setup. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so you can see the setup on the left-hand side. And basically, it's based on rotating disc electrode. And as a chemical engineer, you know, as an engineer, I'd like to build things. So it was based on the rotating disc electrode that allows to have custom-made electrodes made of different metals. And it allows us to measure the corrosion rate of those materials in a very in a good resolution. And in order to study how these materials passivate, what we do is we have this arm with a diamond tip on the surface attached to it, and that diamond tip will remove this very thin oxide layer that's normally there to protect the metal from further oxidation. So by removing this oxide layer constantly, we were studying how these metals change their degradation behavior. And we can actually take that sample and take a local take a material from a very localized area, from the scratched area, and we can see how the microstructure changed. So this is the surface, and this is the bulk of the material. And I don't know if you can see it, but the size of these grains increases towards the bulk of the material. And interestingly, after several scratches, we can see how material is actually starting to fail, because it's forming this kind of crack near the surface. And knowing how these materials degrade is really important, because we really want to improve the asset lifetimes, and we want to be on the safe side of things, right? So in that sense, I just would like to say that it's really important for me to see the importance of work, and yeah, it was quite exciting to do this research for me.
That's really great. And so, you know, it's interesting that metals create an oxide layer that protects them from further degradation, but you wear that off and they can degrade. And
Exactly.
Certainly we all want our hip replacements to last a good long time. These are really interesting questions, again, at that interface between bulk materials and nanoscale issues. And now you're working on your postdoc, and can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there?
Yes, absolutely. So my postdoc is sort of a natural continuation of these coupling effects that we see in materials. And I'm actually studying the battery cathode materials that are used in electric vehicles. And what you can see on your screen is this single powder particle that forms the cathode of our battery. And regarding the scales, so this particle is about 10 microns. And as Mary have mentioned, human hair is about 70 to 100 microns thick. And so this particle is about 10 times thinner than our hair, which is amazing, because what kind of things we can do is we can apply a load. So you can see the load curve on the left, and we can observe how this material will mechanically degrade. And we think that constant charging and discharging of the battery eventually due to this electrochemical charging and discharging, will lead us to this kind of material failure in form of cracks. So again, it's this kind of like interface between electrochemical and mechanical phenomena. And in that sense, it was a continuation of my PhD work. And yes.
That's really fascinating, and in a very important area. We need batteries to last a long time, and these micro cracking processes then are one of the failure mechanisms, I guess. So you're able to, and you will be studying how to improve their durability, I would assume, and design better batteries.
Yes, absolutely. So the capacity fade that we see in the batteries is believed to happen mostly due to this fracture that we see in the cathode materials. And by learning how the battery materials degrade, we can then understand how to design better materials that would be more sustainable and last us for quite a very long time.
Good. I hope that goes well. Well, we have a question from Gianfranco Fagato. What is the next big thing in nanotechnology? So, you know, as you look out, maybe we could start with Mary, because she should be thinking about the next big thing, both for her research and as Vice Dean. But Aigerim, for your own career, as you look out further, what do you think the big thing in nanotechnology?
Well, you know, it's a really interesting question, and we've been spectacularly bad at predicting the next big thing in nanotechnology since nanotechnology was a thing. And I think the original roadmaps for nanotechnology, which were published in the 1980s, said by now that we ought to have self-replicating nanomachines, right? And we're so far behind what we can do, what we should have been, we thought we would deliver with nanotechnology. But I mean, there are some obvious near-term answers where nanotechnology is, you know, starting to make ingress. Healthcare is one, we already talked about that, but I mean, not just in therapies, in terms of sensing and early detection. Some nano-enabled technologies are really, I think, pushing the thresholds of some detection and therapeutics. Quantum computing is going to rely on nanotechnology-enabled systems. And then, of course, the energy transition, I think, is where we're going to see an awful lot of real deployment of nanotechnology at scales we haven't seen before. Catalysis for hydrogen CO2 reduction. There are some that are, I mean, hydrogen is kind of okay, oxygen reduction, CO2 reduction, we're not there yet. So I think that in the energy sector, we're going to see, I think, a lot of strides in the not too distant future in the nanospace.
Aigerim, do you want
But it is interesting to go back and read some of the early roadmaps. Actually, I would advise you to do that just to see how far we were wrong in predicting where we would be.
Aigerim?
Well, in terms of the batteries, I think the next big thing would be how to go beyond maybe the chemistries that we are using now. So I think most of the research will be focused in that area. And obviously, as a person who just came into the battery arena, I can't probably elaborate on that topic that far, but I do agree with Mary's thoughts. And I think energy transition would be the next big area because we just have one planet, right? And yes, sustainability and energy transition would be next.
That's great. And I think perhaps we can talk in a little while a bit more about some of the work at Imperial on towards transition to zero pollution. Right now, I'm wondering, I think many of our audience might be wondering how each of you found yourself in material science, much less nanotechnology, and whether you even knew what a nanometer was when you were younger. Can you tell us a bit about your path? Mary?
Yeah, so I always wish I could give a really clear explanation that I had. You know, I had a plan and I knew what I wanted to do, but to be honest, it was somewhat of a random walk. So I grew up in the north of England in Yorkshire, in an Irish family, as you can probably tell by my name. And I always loved maths. I never had any role models. Actually, growing up, I was I guess, kind of an anomaly even at home. So the rest of my family weren't really into science. I'm one of 5, so 4 sisters and a brother. My father died when we were very young. So I was 7 when my father died. So then it was, I guess, growing up in a really challenging time with, growing up on benefits in a local school. So I look back and think I was lucky in that, I had a really poor but supportive upbringing. It was expected that we did well at school. It was expected that we studied. And in school, it was then expected, the teachers expected me to go to university. And so it wasn't a question that that's what I would do, even though obviously, my generation was the first generation to go. My sister went to university before me. But it wasn't a should I, it was a what do I want to do question, which was, with hindsight, actually, that was not necessarily the path that would happen for someone from my demographic. And I was also, of course, lucky that I was in an era of full student grants and no loans, and there wasn't a financial question that made me think, can I afford to do this? Because that was there and supported. So I love doing maths. It's what I wanted to do. I love maths and physics particularly, and I'm not saying I've got rid of all my procrastination tendencies, but I used to be much worse than I am, and I couldn't decide which I liked best. So I ended up doing a double joint honours in maths and physics. With hindsight, it was a terrible thing to do, because you end up with 60 to 70% of a maths and 60 to 70% of a physics degree, and you're expected to do all of it. But it did, I guess, help me find out what I really enjoyed doing, and that was, being in kind of solid state physics was what I enjoyed, which is pretty close to material science, actually, although the physicists won't admit it. And I didn't even throughout my undergraduate know that material science existed as a discipline. It was something I had never even heard of or thought of. And somebody showed me a leaflet for advertising a master's course in the Materials Science Centre in Manchester. So I was in Manchester, so luckily there was a school of materials and they ran MSc courses. And I went along and talked to them, and I thought, well, this sounds interesting. And again, this was a time when the research councils funded master's courses, right? So my master's course was funded by an EPSLC, or SERC as it was then, studentship, that enabled me to do that. And whilst I was doing my master's, and one of the reasons I wanted to go and do it was they had an STM, a scanning tunneling microscope. So as a physics undergraduate, we were obviously aware that the Nobel Prize had recently been given for this device, and there was a whole ton of ultra high vacuum or homemade systems. But this was a tabletop STM, and I got to do my master's project using that, and got to see atoms for the first time. And it might seem a bit mundane now. We see atoms all the time, but I still remember that feeling of, oh my goodness, you can just look at atoms. You could put a sample in there and you can see the atoms, and then you can do things to those atoms right in the system and see what's happening. And that was just the moment where I thought I want to do research. And then I did a PhD in material science with STM, electrochemical STM. And then I went to the US for a postdoc, and I went to one of the national labs there, the Department of Energy labs on Long Island. And so the Brookhaven Labs is also the home of the National Synchrotron Light Source. And so we did an awful lot of X-ray work in that lab. And it was really there that, I'd done a little bit of X-ray work in my PhD, but being kind of present in the lab and doing it a lot, you recognize the power of synchrotron experiments to study some of these operando in situ problems. Not just what does your material look like day one that you make it, what is happening to that material as you start to use it in the device that you've made or in the environment that it ends up in. And X-rays are a really beautiful way to study some of those experiments. I probably should explain what a synchrotron is very quickly for those that don't know what a synchrotron is, but you should go and look up the Diamond Light Source in the UK. And so it's basically you accelerate electrons in a ring, and you accelerate them to near the speed of light. And every time you bend the beam of electrons around, you're going to emit X-rays, and you create light that's about 1 billion times the brightness of the sun. So you've got an enormous amount of intensity with which to study your system. And from there I came to Imperial, and that was in 1998, and I've been here since I was doing material science.
That's great, and thank you for that explanation and your remarkable excitement on seeing atoms and then your ability to study them with X-rays. I think everyone can understand how powerful that is because you have the technology and the techniques now that can do things that decades before we couldn't. Aigerim, your background and how did you end up in this work?
Well, actually, Alice, both of my parents are chemists. And I guess I was in a world of science from a very early age. My mom actually made me learn the periodic table when I was 7 years old. So she would ask for the atomic weights of materials over dinner, you know. So yeah, exciting. And she was a teacher, right? And she taught me a great deal of chemistry. And from there, I had a love of chemistry. And in school, I did, as Mary, quite well in math. I loved solving math problems. I had a really great math teacher who was very strict, challenging, although very strict, but she was challenging us a lot. She would give us extra start problems as a homework and to push us further. And yes, when it came to university, major choosing time, there was this new university opening up in Kazakhstan called Nazarbayev University. And there were two majors that were kind of interesting to me. So one was chemistry. And in order to do chemistry, you had to pass biology and chemistry subject tests. I didn't really understand biology because I didn't have a good teacher. So again, importance of having good teachers should be reiterated. So I instead chose to do physics and math and went into chemical engineering. And I don't think I had a very good idea what chemical engineering was as a subject back when I was first starting my degree. And it ended up to be this heavily math-oriented thermodynamics. You know, you're a chemical engineer, right, Alice? So, but I enjoyed the coursework very much. And I always wanted to do a PhD. So I started researching different programs throughout the world. And many of the topics that interested me had to do with materials. So I thought, why not do material science as a master's at first place, and then see where it takes me. I just still remember how I was Googling top 10 material science institutions around the world, and Imperial came up. And I actually visited London the year before, and I was amazed by this campus. It was great, next to Hyde Park, you know, next to these great museums. And I applied to material science. I did a project with Mary, and yes, here we are till this day.
That's fabulous that these are both wonderfully inspiring stories, and maybe later we can talk a bit about what you would say to school girls and boys that may be on this call. Aigerim, we do have a technical question, so I did want to go back to your beautiful image of crushing that little small particle. And Dr. Gurpreet Singh asks about the single particle compression graph, and he understands that the applied load in millinewtons is quite straightforward from the AFM, that's atomic force microscope tip, but he wants to know how the displacement was measured on the x-axis.
Right, so this setup is actually piezoelectric setup, and we place it inside the SEM. And the way it measures the load is basically, I might be wrong here, but let me think about it for a second. Yes, so it's all programmed, and it's actually a little startup that creates this setup, and it's called Alemnis. And we measure basically load from the displacement. And it's a bit of a software engineering going in the background, and it gives us its displacement, but we always have to correct for the displacements of the machine, and it's a totally different area, and I don't want to bore you with the technicalities at the moment.
Yes. It must be calibrated or
yeah, exactly, absolutely, we have to calibrate it.
But I think to Capri, I think the point is that this is not load controlled, it's displacement controlled in the system. And then we measure the load with transducers. So it's in the SEM, it's not atom, it's not an AFM indenter, then it's displacement controlled, which gives us much better, I guess, control of how we crack or how we instigate the failures.
Yeah, we can go anywhere from 1 millinewton to 500.
That's great. So thinking about your paths and the influence of teachers, you're interested in maths and physics and science and chemistry. What kind of things would you say to young people if they're in school and they're thinking about what they should study going forward?
Can I start, Mary?
Let me start. I think it's so important to do something that you love, right? That you've got to have an ability, right? And some, I guess, so yes, an ability to do the maths and physics. But you've got to find a topic that really inspires you, because it's hard. Whatever you choose is going to be hard work, right? So you've got to enjoy it. But I think also to not be put off by old-fashioned stereotypes of who can do different things, right? I think there are so many examples of engineering as an inclusive and science engineering as, I guess, an inclusive community, that people that just believe that they can do what they want to do, right? So I think I would advise people to have probably a level of self-belief that's quite difficult. And I know that that's quite difficult, but if you can try and just, I guess, hold on to the fact that you really want to do it and you like it, and then you will find a path. And find a mentor, find a good teacher that can help you, and ask questions. Go to places and just ask questions of people about how to find, how to go in certain directions.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions coming in. Irene asks if there are examples of materials or systems in nature at the nano level that we are just not aware of, that inspire your research and maybe you could influence what you design.
Oh, there are lots of examples of nanoscale structures in nature. And actually what nature does really well is what we would call hierarchical structures. So it has, multiple functionalities at different length scales, right? And that's one thing we do try to take inspiration from. So bone is a great example, which has this multi-layers of, mineralized nanocrystals and collagen fibers at different length scales, and they perform slightly different functions. You can look at examples from how leaves grow and organization within plant systems that again have this. So nature is not just good at one scale, right? Nature is optimized across many length scales in terms of. So if you think, let's just think about, we talked about photovoltaics earlier, but you could think about a length scale that is on the wavelength of light, right? So micron scale or nearly micron scale that you might use as a kind of a band gap or to trap light in a certain way. But then if you want to extract energy from light, you have to have separation of electrons and holes in your material, and that requires you to have nanoscale interfaces. So I think these kind of hierarchical system that nature does really well are brilliant examples of where we should be taking an inspiration from, and in fact lots of researchers do.
Like abalone shells and their rainbow colors.
Exactly like that.
And butterfly wings and other shells and other materials from nature. Wonderful. Michael Ajana asks, what do you perceive would be the impact of predictive multiscale material design on nanotechnology?
Well, so, I mean, this is one of those areas as well. I mean, let me just say it would be enormous. If we could properly do absolute predictive multiscale material design, then we could, effectively short circuit a lot of experiments. We could just dial in the properties that you want and then make the material. But I think we're some way from being in that place, partly because we fully don't understand all the physics of the material system. So I think we still need to do some more hypothesis testing and experiments on materials to validate the models. And then we still have to think about, if a model gives you a specific design, how do you then make it and process it? And that's not always trivial to do, right? To create the structure that is predicted in silico, right? To make it in the real world. Models or simulations of materials are becoming more and more sophisticated every year, right? So I think we are now getting to the place where we can start to really have predictive capabilities. But in terms of scaling up to kind of bulk systems, there's still some way to go. When it is there, it will be enormous.
We are getting towards that ability. We have that robotic chemistry, combinatoric chemistry out at White City, and colleagues working on that.
Yeah. And we've got this balance between, how much is data driven. So what can you learn from just analyzing data versus how much is what you might call physics driven, right? We fundamentally understand the theories that underpin behavior. And you need a balance of those two things, right? Because sometimes, and I guess this comes back a little bit to thinking about how you even measure things at the nanoscale, because there's such a potential for statistical anomalies, right? You look at 1 or 2 nanoparticles and you extrapolate that to 1 million, but sometimes the really interesting things only happen in 1 or 2 nanoparticles, right? And I guess the data approach doesn't necessarily pull those things out, but the theoretical approach does. So it's not obvious how to use all of these things in the most effective way, but the progress is being remarkable.
Thanks. And Kevin Doyle asks, how well understood is the safety of nanoparticles in medical applications? You talked about those particles in your...
So how well understood is it? So we're not at the level where you could take, if I said, here's a nanoparticle, this is its structure and chemistry, you could predict its safety, right? We are not at that level yet. You still have to do tests to make sure that it is safe or to work out what the safe dose is, right? So, there's the poison is in the dose, but we are learning a lot about the kind of properties of nanoparticles that control toxicity, right? And that's to do with, the solubility effect, the interaction with enzymes, whether they will trigger some of these in this immune response, whether they can trigger certain biological responses that will be detrimental. And sometimes it's the particles that are the most inert that cause the most trouble, because the body is trying to get rid of particles, right? So and if it can't dissolve it, or it can't get rid of it in its conventional way, then that triggers this inflammatory response signaling. So we're learning a lot about, I guess, what you might call a safety envelope. So things that we know are safe for use, but we are still at the point where you will have to do in vitro and then in vivo testing before you could just utilize a particle. But it's quite interesting. A lot of there's differentials in toxicities between different cells, right? So you can, the zinc oxide particle that I just showed you in the cancer cells are much more susceptible to that than healthy tissue. So this, by really carefully understanding the dose response and either targeting, so you deliver only to a local place, or titrating your system, so the dose is toxic to certain parts of your system but not to others. But we're, again, it's one of those things, there's a lot of work to do, because there's such an enormous parameter space in the types of nanoparticles you can make. So covering that is tough.
Indeed. And so in a related question, perhaps a bit more about collaboration and how you're working across these disciplines, Charlotte points to you talking about going across from understanding rust to cancer treatment, and asks how can knowledge be shared effectively across disciplines to understand the potential parallels in apparently unconnected fields? Your aha moment of realizing something was applicable to another field. But how do you work then? And how does this work across disciplines, at least at Imperial?
So, well, I mean, this is one of the reasons I love being at Imperial, because there are lots of conversations that happen across disciplines, right? And sometimes that happens in the institutes that bring people together. Sometimes it happens in the centers, and sometimes you just, you meet people and you get connected by people. And Imperial is very open to those kind of collaborations. How well is it shared and how effectively it's shared? I mean, that's still a challenge. The first one, of course, is language, right? That people trained in different disciplines, they're both speaking English, but they're not understanding each other. So getting to a place where you can have a conversation about what's important from the different disciplines, I think is really needed. And we've actually been trying to do quite a bit of work on that with our students to help thinking about the difference in language across disciplines and how that, or it actually is a big barrier, and how can we bring that down to help people better communicate. And I really think it's only by doing some of these interdisciplinary calls and challenges and workshops that we already do quite a lot of at Imperial, but it's only by making people talk to each other we start to see these connections. And then I think being somewhat brave enough to say, actually, this thing over there that's to do with rust is the same thing that's happening here in the middle of your battery or in your hip replacement, because you have to step into a different field, right? And that's hard. And some people might not feel confident enough to do that. So I think we have to be open to people coming to us from different fields, right? So I think the onus is on the community that the person bringing the different perspective in is to be open to those different suggestions.
So there's a related question from Stephen Boxhall. Let's see, how can we, or are we already, cascading nanotechnology down from the level of professors to technicians and getting the communication and knowledge moving in both directions? Is it something we should be teaching in schools, or how do we foster this? I agree totally about your level, Marion, and at Imperial, the interactions, the collaborations, I think have been fabulous. Antimicrobial resistance brought people from all over campus interested in the problem and how they could bring their different approaches to it. Your transition to zero pollution initiative is pulling people together. I guess on the education and translation front, we should think about how we're doing that with education and outreach, perhaps, too.
Yeah, so I guess that's for me again. You have to bring Aigerim back into the conversation.
Well,
so
Aigerim, I might turn it to her also, because she's chaired the Electrochemical Society, or revived or formed it, and so there's a lot of knowledge exchange that happens in those groups as well.
Yeah.
You need to unmute Aigerim and tell us about how you tell your friends about nanotechnology.
So yes, Alice, I think absolutely communication is a crucial part of our work, of the work that we do. And I think one example of it was actually at Imperial, where there were quite a lot of electrochemists, right, across different departments. But there wasn't one community of electrochemists as it is. And we actually went ahead and started the student chapter of the Electrochemical Society at Imperial. And we learned that people are using electrochemistry for various research areas. And from electrodeposition to corrosion to batteries to biomaterials and etc. And it was quite exciting for us to learn this sort of interdisciplinary work that was going on. And inspired from the community of the student electrochemists was the electrochemical network that was established at Imperial College London, right? And I think these kind of networks are important for us to communicate as scientists between ourselves and also communicate with the outer world about our research. Another example I can bring on is the Union of Kazakhstan PhD Girls. So it's called KZ PhD Girls Union. Hi, if you're watching. So basically, it is a blog that's formed in social media called Instagram, where we share our experience as PhD students and as postdoctorate researchers. And we write these short blogs every Thursday about our journey, how we decided to do a PhD, how we chose our topic, and supervisors, what to look out for, how to write papers, all those different kinds of things. And we actually had quite a lot of questions asked from us, from prospective students and people who would like to start this PhD journey. And I think that's another shows the importance of communication, because if we're out there on Instagram, where all these students are, we can communicate with them better, and we are available for any questions they might ask us, right? And yeah, that's another example I would like to share.
That's great. And we just need to find those right avenues and the right people like you to help us with that. And Mary, I think we should say a little bit about the outreach work our colleagues do. We do a lot to schools, as well as now at the invention rooms in White City. And the festival, I'll put in a plug for the Great Exhibition Road Festival, and how the public and people bring their children, and you start to have your first moment of seeing atoms, as it were, and getting excited about science.
And Alice, I should just talk about the Great Exhibition Road Festival and our partners. There was a project that we ran for several years, and I think we actually ran it the first year with the master students when Aigerim was doing the MSc, which was with the Victor and Albert Museum. And we created basically trails around objects in the V&A that contained nanomaterials. So we made the students go find objects. With instructions, they weren't allowed to take samples. They had to deduce that there were nanomaterials in those objects. And there are things like, stained glass that has gold nanoparticles, and that way you get this ruby color, to silk that's got, the nanoscale fibers in it, to ivory, to Damascus steel. There's all kinds of brilliant examples in the museum where the properties of that material, and normally they're aesthetic, sometimes not, is because of some kind of nanoscale property in them. And we created these beautiful guides to go around the V&A just to find nanomaterials. So that was a really brilliant project. And we targeted it. One year we targeted at 10-year-olds, and the next year we targeted at 15-year-olds. So it was a beautiful South Kensington project from the out, but did some really nice outreach.
And in particular, in that outreach, we're very much trying to encourage girls to think about these things. You mentioned confidence, Mary and Aigerim, both of you, and you found confidence for teachers along the way, from your family members. Do you have some messages for girls who are watching, and what do you think we can do to help girls find their way to exciting research, exciting things to do that are important for society in science and engineering?
Well, I think we still have to keep fighting the pervasive narrative, right, and language and unconscious bias that happens to girls in schools. So with the Royal Academy of Engineering, I've been part of the working group on the This Is Engineering initiative, which is really trying to change stereotypes. And that's been a really amazing scheme, actually, and has reached literally millions of teenagers. And this is actually, trying to, one, make people understand that engineering is this very broad church, right? And you can do all kinds of different cool things in engineering. And two, that it really is an open field for everyone. But I think we as academics and students and practitioners need to be talking directly to schools, right? Because I think there is still a lot of work to be done to make people, that we're losing people at 12, 13, 14-year-old, right? Because they don't decide to choose to do the right GCSEs, or they don't choose the right A-levels. And if we don't see them until they're thinking about university, then it's too late, right? And the outreach team, I know, is doing a lot of work, but I think there is still a lot more to be done in challenging, I think, particularly around language, and how language is used in schools to be better encouraging of all different demographics into engineering and science.
Yes, thank you. And networks such as what Aigerim was just describing should be very powerful, because as she said, prospective students have started to get into touch. And so going back home and visiting and talking to people about opportunities is another way to reach younger audiences. And so I don't know if you'd like to add anything more, Aigerim, about that.
I think I would just reiterate that it's really important just to keep doing what you're good at, keep doing what you enjoy. Don't think about what kind of job you'll do, in a sense, because, you know, if we think too far in the future, we sometimes tend to lose this passion for things that we enjoyed doing as kids. And just have a belief in yourself that eventually you'll find your way, all the dots will connect in the future. And yes, I think hard work is important. It was really expected from us that we would work hard in order to, you know, see the world. And I think another thing I want to say is just try to reach a little bit further and be friends with people who are better than you in terms of, you know, knowledge. And yeah, I would say I get fascinated by people who are really brilliant in what they do, and I always want to learn from them. And another thing I want to add is don't be afraid to learn new things. Don't be intimidated by new areas. So for example, when I switched to material science after my chemical engineering undergraduate degree, it was quite hard, but eventually with time, you will learn it, right? And it will only broaden your horizons and make you a more faceted researcher in the end.
Well, thank you very much. And it's really great to hear you say, you know, have confidence and the dots will connect, and keep your options open, keep your eyes open, and enjoy learning new things. And I think that's been a marvelous opportunity this afternoon to talk to you both. I want to thank you for sharing your stories with us, and thank the audience for their great questions. A lot of technical questions out there and a lot of interest in nano materials, which is exciting. Let me just finish by saying this is the 7th and last in our series of current and future women luminaries. It's been really inspiring to hear their aha moments, their aspirations, their journeys and challenges. And we hope you've enjoyed this series. We look forward to welcoming you back in the autumn with more inspiring women, and hopefully one day an in-person networking reception. So that'll be a great opportunity for us to celebrate and to get to know one another and to follow up with more questions. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful summer.
Thank you.